The letter had said he needed a woman who could cook. And Eleanor Hayes had read those words so many times at her kitchen table in Chicago that the paper had gone soft at the folds, the ink slightly faded where her thumb had pressed again and again, as though repetition might reveal something the words themselves were not saying. Outside the window, the city moved the way cities always move, without pause, without mercy, without any particular awareness of the small lives being lived inside the buildings it pressed against. She was 34 years old. She had been a wife. Then she had been a widow. And for the last 2 years she had been something harder to name. A woman still standing in rooms that used to hold more, cooking meals for one, folding laundry that took almost no time at all, waking each morning to a silence so thorough and complete it had begun to feel less like quiet and more like an answer she had not asked for. She had not answered the advertisement because she was fearless. She had answered it because she had finally understood that surviving and living were not the same thing, and that the distance between the two was exactly the length of a decision she had been too afraid to make until now. A widower in Montana, 8 children, a ranch, a life waiting hundreds of miles away from everything familiar. She packed what she had into a battered leather suitcase, and she did not look back at the apartment for very long, because looking back, she had learned, was a thing that could hold a person in place forever if they let it. The train rolled into Willow Ridge on a cold Thursday afternoon in late October, and Eleanor stepped down onto the weathered platform into a wind that found her immediately, pulling at her coat, pushing a loose strand of chestnut hair across her face. She tucked it behind her ear and stood still for a moment, letting her eyes move across the platform. A freight worker shifted crates near the tracks. An old woman sat on a bench wrapped tightly in a wool shawl, her eyes closed, her face tipped slightly upward, as though she were listening for something no one else could hear. And at the far edge of the station, beside a mud-worn wagon with a horse standing patient and still in the traces, was a tall man with broad shoulders and a stillness about him that was not peace. Eleanor knew it the moment she looked at him. Some grief makes noise. It breaks dishes and raises its voice and fills every room it enters. Daniel Carter's grief was the other kind, the kind that sits so quietly on a person for so long that eventually it stops looking like grief at all and starts looking like just the way a man stands. He did not wave. He did not walk toward her. He simply watched, the way a man watches weather coming in from the mountains, not afraid of it, not welcoming it, just measuring what it might bring and whether he is ready. She walked to him across the platform, and he looked at her for several long seconds before he spoke. "You traveled alone," he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," she said. "Long journey?" It was. He nodded once, and then his eyes moved to the suitcase in her hand. "That's all you brought?" Eleanor looked down at the worn leather case. Everything she still owned that mattered was inside it. 3 dresses, her mother's Bible, a sewing kit in a tin box, and a cookbook with a cracked spine held together with a length of kitchen string, its pages soft and warped and written over in the margins in her own hand, recipes adjusted and annotated across years of cooking for a man who was no longer alive to eat them. It was enough to carry, she said. Something crossed his face very briefly, not warmth, not amusement, but a flicker of something that looked like recognition, as though she had said a thing he understood from the inside. He lifted the suitcase without another word and loaded it into the wagon and climbed to the seat. Eleanor settled beside him. They drove for nearly an hour through country that silenced her completely. The Montana sky had no ceiling. Golden grass moved across the plains in long, slow waves. The mountains to the west wore their first snow like something permanent, like something that had been there since before the territory had a name. She had never seen landscape like it, this big and this indifferent and this quietly magnificent. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, and also the loneliest, the kind of country that shows a person the full size of the world and the full smallness of a single human life inside it. Daniel Carter had come to Montana from Tennessee 17 years ago with $20 and a young wife named Ruth, and the kind of stubbornness that young men sometimes carry in place of wisdom until the land teaches them the difference. He had built the ranch post by post and board by board through winters that were not gentle and summers that gave nothing easily, and Ruth had stood beside him through all of it, her laugh carrying across the yard on good mornings, her steadiness holding the house together on the hard ones. She had given him 8 children and 21 years, and a life that was not easy but was full in all the ways that fullness matters. Then a fever had come in January, the kind that moves fast and listens to nothing, and in 11 days Ruth Carter was gone, and Daniel was left standing in a house that still smelled like her bread and still held the shape of her in every corner, with 8 children watching him each morning to see if the world was still something a person could stand up in. He had managed the month since the way a man manages a bad wound in the field when there is no doctor, pressing on because stopping is not a thing he knows how to do, because the cattle need feeding and the fence needs mending and 8 children need breakfast, and grief, however large it is, does not pause the world around it. He had written the advertisement the night he stood in the kitchen doorway and watched Emily, his oldest, standing alone at the stove at 2 in the morning, trying for the 4th time that week to bake her mother's bread, her shoulders set with a determination that broke his heart, because it was not the determination of a girl becoming strong, it was the determination of a child disappearing under a weight she had never been meant to carry.
The ranch came into view at sunset, the last light catching the white farmhouse and turning it gold for a moment before settling into gray. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, straight line. The barn leaned slightly to the east. Fence posts along the south pasture wanted replacing. A wagon wheel leaned against the porch railing with the patience of something that had been waiting a long time for attention. Everything on the property was still standing. Nothing was broken past saving, but everything wore the look of a place that had lost the person who loved it most, that particular tiredness that comes not from age, but from absence. Children moved through the yard in the fading light. A boy of 12 named Thomas carried water from the pump with the focused expression of a child who had given himself a man's job and was not going to be caught failing at it. 2 small girls chased each other near the chicken coop, their laughter the only sound on the property that did not carry weight. Twins of 9 named Samuel and George rolled in the dirt near the barn with the complete commitment of boys who have not yet been told the world requires more of them. And on the porch, arms folded across her chest, jaw set, stood Emily, 17 years old, tall like her father, eyes like her mother, dark and steady and capable of seeing more than most people wanted seen. She looked at Eleanor the way people look at something arriving that they have already decided not to trust, not from cruelty, but from a kind of exhausted self-protection. The look of someone who has been disappointed by hope before and has decided that caution is cheaper than the alternative. Eleanor climbed the porch steps and met that gaze without looking away and without offering anything false. She did not smile the smile of a woman trying to be liked. She did not speak first. She let Emily look at her for as long as she needed to, and then she said quietly, "I am not here to be your mother. I know that is not something that can be replaced or asked for. I am here to help carry what is too heavy for any one person to carry alone. That is all." Emily said nothing, but her arms, which had been folded tight across her chest, loosened slightly, just slightly. It was not welcome, but it was the absence of a door being shut, and Eleanor understood that for now that was enough. The first supper she made was simple: salt pork and cornbread and stewed tomatoes from the last of the summer's canning, because simple was what the kitchen had, and simple was what the room needed. Not a performance, not a statement, just food, warm and ready, and someone moving through the kitchen like it was a place worth being in. When Clara, the smallest of the girls, looked up from her plate with the directness only very young children possess and said, "Your cornbread is different from Mama's," the table went so quiet Eleanor could hear the fire. She looked at the child and said, "I expect it is. Your Mama's was probably better, but I hope you will give mine a fair chance." Clara chewed, considered.
"It is pretty good," she said, and the table breathed again. Not warmly, not easily, but it breathed, and that was a beginning. The weeks that followed taught Eleanor things no letter could have prepared her for. She learned that Thomas, the 12-year-old who carried water and split wood and fed the horses before anyone else was awake, needed one word of acknowledgement at the start of each day, where he would carry a quiet wound through all the hours of it, invisible but real. She learned that Samuel and George, the twins, were not difficult so much as they were lonely in a way that expressed itself as conflict, and that the remedy was not discipline but individual attention, one given a task here and the other there, each made to feel singular and necessary. She learned that the 3 middle children, a girl of 14 named Nora and 2 boys of 11 and 13, were grieving in near silence, the way children sometimes do when they believe the adults around them are already carrying too much. She sat with each of them in small moments, not forcing conversation, just being present, and slowly the silence around them became less like walls and more like open ground. And she learned that Emily did not want help. What Emily wanted was company, which was an entirely different thing, and the moment Eleanor understood that distinction was the moment something between them began to change. She stopped trying to lead in the kitchen and started simply being there. She asked instead of directed. She let Emily set the pace and make the decisions, and when the bread came out wrong, which it did at first, she said nothing except to ask whether Emily wanted to try it a different way. And sometimes Emily did, and sometimes she did not, and Eleanor accepted both answers with the same quietness. 3 weeks in, Emily's bread came out right for the first time. She stood at the kitchen table looking at it for a long moment, and Eleanor stood beside her saying nothing, because nothing was exactly what the moment needed. Then Emily said, very low, almost to herself, "Mama would have said it needed more salt." Eleanor said, "She might have been right. Try it with more salt next time." Emily looked at her then, a real look, the first one, and said, "You are not what I expected." Eleanor said, "Neither are you." And something that had been locked between them for weeks opened just enough to let the light through. The hardest night came in the 6th week. A November storm came down from the mountains with no warning, the kind that moves fast and means it, and by 10 o'clock there was a foot of snow on the ground, and Daniel and Thomas and the 2 older boys were out in the dark, moving cattle away from the low ground where they would freeze before morning. Eleanor stayed in the house. She built the fire high. She kept every lantern lit. She made up long, slow stories for the little ones, stories about brave horses and frozen rivers and families who found their way home through impossible weather. And Clara fell asleep against her arm on the settee, and the twins talked themselves quiet on the rug, and the middle children drifted off one by one until the house was still, except for the wind. Daniel came in just after 1 in the morning, snow-covered, hands stiff, the cold coming off him like something solid. She had coffee hot and food warm. She said nothing about the hour. He sat at the table and looked at her across the kitchen, and after a long moment, he said low and rough, "Ruth used to do that. Keep everything lit when the weather came in bad." Eleanor said simply, "It seemed right." He looked down at his coffee, and Eleanor saw something shift in him, not break, not soften exactly, but move, the way ice moves in a river when the temperature is finally turning, when what has been locked solid begins, very slowly, to come free. She understood in that moment that she had not come here to replace Ruth Carter. She had come here to make it possible for this family to carry her memory without being crushed by it. Christmas arrived the way it does in hard years, not with fanfare, but with a kind of quiet insistence, a refusal to be ignored, no matter how much grief might prefer it. Eleanor did not try to recreate what had been. She understood that the worst thing she could do was attempt a replica of a Christmas that belonged to someone else. Instead, she helped the children make gifts for one another from what the ranch provided, cloth scraps and cedar wood and bits of ribbon and good intentions. And she taught Emily the sugar cookie recipe from her mother's cookbook, standing beside her in the kitchen while the snow came down in the dark outside, the two of them working in a companionship that had been built slowly and honestly over weeks of small moments and had become, without either of them naming it, something real. Emily did not burn a single batch. She stood at the table, arranging them on the cloth, with a care that was also a kind of grief and also a kind of pride, and Eleanor watched her and said nothing, because some moments are complete without words, and adding words to them only makes them smaller. On Christmas morning, Daniel pressed a small package into Eleanor's hand before the children came downstairs. Inside was a length of blue ribbon, the exact shade she had paused over for a moment at the general store in town 6 weeks earlier, a pause she had not known he noticed. She held it in her palm and looked at it for a long moment, and then looked at him. "Thank you, Daniel," she said. He said, "Thank you for staying." 4 words, spoken quietly in a cold kitchen on a Montana morning while the sound of 8 children waking drifted through the ceiling above them. They were not a declaration of love. They were something more lasting than that. They were a man who had spent a year with his hand pressed hard against a wound, who had just, for the first time, allowed himself to believe that healing was not a betrayal of what he had lost. Eleanor Hayes had come to Montana because a letter said a man needed someone who could cook. What she had carried in that soft folded letter and that worn leather suitcase was not a recipe or a skill or even a willingness to work hard, though all of those things were true. What she had carried was the deep, patient knowledge that people who have been broken by loss do not need to be fixed. They need to be witnessed. They need someone willing to stand in the wreckage with them, without flinching, without rushing them toward a morning they're not yet ready for, and simply, stubbornly, faithfully remain. Some things cannot be packed into a suitcase, but steadiness can. Patience can. The quiet refusal to leave when leaving would be easier, that can be carried a very long way. And it turns out that sometimes it is exactly the thing a family has been waiting for without knowing how to ask. If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you that the most powerful thing one person can offer another is simply the willingness to stay, please subscribe to Desert Heart and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story. Every week we bring you tales from the American frontier, stories of quiet courage and ordinary faithfulness, and the kind of love that does not announce itself but shows up before sunrise and stays past dark. Leave a comment below and tell us which moment reached you most. This story is grounded in the documented American frontier practice of mail-order courtship and marriage, common throughout the 1850s to 1880s, in which Eastern women answered newspaper advertisements placed by widowed or single settlers in Western territories who needed partners to help sustain homestead and ranch life. It reflects the authentic psychological burden placed on eldest children, particularly daughters, in frontier households that lost their mothers. children who were expected to absorb adult domestic responsibilities without training or preparation. This story also illustrates the economic and emotional fragility of cattle ranching in territorial Montana, the isolation of frontier family life, and the way that ordinary human patience and faithful daily presence served as the primary form of emotional healing available to grieving families in an era before any professional support existed. The character of Eleanor represents the historical reality of thousands of women who carried their own losses quietly westward and built new lives not from abundance, but from the willingness to begin again.